All right, welcome everybody. We're officially getting started now. I'm Rabbi Micah Streiffer. I'm the director of Laasok, and I'm really excited to welcome my friend and colleague, maybe one of my oldest friends in the rabbinate, right, Mike? Rabbi Michael Satz, to have this conversation with me today and next week about Judaism and democracy. So for those of you who are regular weekly Tikva through text attendees, you probably know by now we're doing something a little different this week. This is going to be an hour-long session, as will next week, and we'll be exploring what we're calling ancient values for modern times. We explore some of the Jewish roots of democracy. So a quick note about how this is going to work, because we've never done anything quite like this before, with two people leading a class at the same time. So Rabbi Satz is going to kind of take the lead this week. He's going to lead us through some texts and some ideas. I will jump in liberally to engage him in conversation, which those who attend Tikva through text every week know that I do anyway, because I can't help myself. But we also want you to engage with us. So if you have questions or comments or things like that, please raise your hand electronically, which you can do at the bottom of your screen in React, so that we can call on you and engage you in this conversation as well. With that in mind, I'm going to share my screen. And no, let's do introductions first. So I'll intro Rabbi Satz and he'll intro me. Then we're going to say the blessing for study, and then we will jump into our discussion. So Rabbi Michael Satz is honored to lead Temple B'nai Or on its important mission of being a vibrant and meaningful center of Jewish life in Morris County. He brings his passions for teaching, justice, and spirituality to to this multi-generational community. Rabbi Satz believes that Judaism is a dynamic, evolving, and pluralistic tradition. Through texts, music, prayer, peoplehood, and personal relationships, we experience God's presence. The rabbi's calling, he says, is to help facilitate these experiences for Jews in sacred community. If I can just add a line to your bio, Rabbi Satz. Rabbi Michael Satz is one of the most erudite and knowledgeable rabbis that I know. And I just want to say that. So I'll turn it over to him to intro me.
Well, you do know a lot of rabbis, and I would say that maybe, not the top 10. Also, I won't say that I'm the top 10 area rabbis that you know. So, but, more than 50%, that's okay. So thank you very much. Also, Rabbi Michael Streiffer, also one of the most erudite and knowledgeable and wise rabbis I know. But Rabbi Michael Streiffer is a teacher, a writer, a lifelong student who is known for his engaging teaching style and his ability to make Jewish texts and ideas come to life. Micah is founder of Laasok, virtual Beit Midrash, or virtual house of study, where liberal Jewish learners can deepen their connection with Judaism through meaningful engagement with sacred text. In addition, he hosts the popular 7-Minute Torah podcast, a weekly exploration of the Torah portion through modern eyes, something that I listen to all the time to get ready for my weekly sermons and often, steal ideas from him. So, it's a good Shabbat preparation. But I have to also add that Rabbi Micah Streiffer is one of the founding members of the legendary but short-lived rabbinical school rock band called the Minor Prophets.
It's true. We founded it together. In fact,
Yeah.
I had a prophet named Micah. You did not. So do you want to tell everybody what your prophet name was?
I became the prophet Obadiah.
That's right. We really rocked the Cincinnati and Northern Kentucky Jewish music scene
Yes,
for a couple of years there.
true.
And then share my
So,
oh, go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
I'm going to share my screen. We're going to say the blessing for study together, and then we're going to jump into this conversation. And like I said, please join us. Please raise your hand if you have thoughts to share. All right, if you'd like, you can unmute. We'll say this blessing together, and then we will begin. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And
Amen.
that means in Hebrew, blessed is the eternal whose mitzvot, whose commandments make our lives holy, and who commands us to immerse, to engage in words of Torah. So Rabbi
Amen.
Satz, why don't you start us off?
Great. I'm just pulling up. Um, so this morning, or this afternoon now, for probably a lot of us, but maybe this morning for some of us, uh, I want to look at some very classical texts of the Jewish canon, meaning the all except for one at the end are from the fifth book of the Torah, Devarim or Deuteronomy. Uh, but I want to kind of geek out a bit on political science and political theory. Um, because I studied that in undergrad, and it often informs how I read texts. But I want to start with the question. I'll stop sharing the for a second. I want to ask the question: what is democracy? Right. So, like, maybe you can put some suggestions in the chat. What is democracy? Maybe that's why we're here. We got to find out. The rule of the people. Very nice. As Bob says. Good. Government for the people, by the people, Stacy says. Leadership determined via voting. Power rests in the hands of the people. A governing entity for the people, through the people, from the people. Fair representation. Government by the people, for the people. The ability, someone said it's going to fest. The ability to have a say in how our government is run and who our leaders are. Very good. These are all good things. Fair representation. Fair representation. Laney says, yes. All of those things, I think, have to do right. To summarize all of those, I think it has to do with questions of sovereignty, right? Like who's in charge, and everybody said the people, right? And then sometimes questions of how we enact that sovereignty, right? Choosing leaders, right? Having different institutions that govern, right? Through chosen leaders. Right? Now, when we talk about the Bible, we talk about classical Jewish thought. We can't say that it's democratic in that people got to vote for all the leaders, right? And I don't know if we can say that it's democratic in that the people are sovereign, but I will throw out this thesis that God is sovereign and the people enact God's sovereignty, right? And maybe, hopefully, we can see that a little bit. Now, what do I mean by sovereignty? That means, well, it's very different for those of us who are here who are American versus those who are Canadian on the call. Because in Canada, who is sovereign?
Ooh, I know. New Canadian here.
Yes,
King Charles.
King Charles is sovereign. But in a constitutional monarchy like Canada, like United Kingdom, like Belgium, whatever, the king or the monarch represents the people in some way, right? They're not the owner of the land, which would have been like a medieval king, right? They represent the people, but it's still, they are the sovereign. While in America, there is no, the people are the people, right? And so sovereignty is presumably in the hands of the people, right? Now, in the Bible, though, sovereignty is in the hands of God, and we'll see what we might mean for that. So let's look at chapter 16 of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, because I want to get wonky here, because this is the part of the Torah that spells out institutions. And then through the discussion of these institutions, we'll discuss what is the political theory here about who has power, how is power exercised, and things like that, right? And hopefully we'll see that while maybe we can't say that the Bible is democratic as we understand it today, it has given our society democratic ideas. And I will say that especially the book of Deuteronomy was very important for the American founders and for people in the Scottish Enlightenment and the Dutch Enlightenment, people who influenced the founders of America too. Okay, so chapter 16 of Deuteronomy in the middle of the chapter. This is the beginning of the Torah portion called Shoftim, which means judges. You shall appoint magistrates and officials. The word for officials is shotrim for your tribes in all the settlements that the Eternal your God is giving you. And they shall govern the people with due justice. The word is mishpat. You shall not judge unfairly. You shall show no partiality. You shall not take bribes, for bribes blind the eyes of the discerning and upset the plea of the just. And here's a famous line that I know we in the Reform movement always say, right? Sedek, sedek, tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Eternal your God is giving you. Okay, pause. Let's now think, constitutionally, what are we setting up here?
Can I jump in and say something that I
Please,
noticed?
please.
There are two words for justice here. There are two words here that are translated as justice.
Good. Mishpat, yeah. So mishpat and tzedek.
Yeah, exactly. And mishpat, I think, has to do more with orderliness, and tzedek has to do more with rightness, maybe moral rightness, but also sort of general, that which is right versus that which is
Yeah.
partial or bribe related.
Good. So maybe mishpat has to do with the institution itself, right? Because a judge is called a shofet, which is the same root as mishpat. The institution we set up is orderly and is fair. While tzedek has to do, if I'm picking up what you're saying, Micah, tzedek has to do with the ideal that the institution holds up to, right?
There are a couple comments in the chat also, if you want me to bring them up.
Please.
Ira mentioned social justice, ruling with values based on Torah, and then Mary talks about a governing body selected by the people.
Yes, thank you, Mary. I did not put you there as a plant. Notice you. Who is this? You shall appoint. The you in the book of Deuteronomy. Moses is speaking to all the people: the men, the women, the rich people, the poor people, the children. It says that over and over again. The you is everybody. And not only is it you, not everybody, it's also local, right? And all your settlements. And if we could think about like America and Canada, it's federal, meaning each tribe has kind of their own area and maybe even their own slight way of doing things, right? And their own people that they choose from, right? That I think that's in there, right? And this is the first branch that Deuteronomy brings up. So this is, I read things. A lot of my talk today comes from reading the late American Israeli political scientist Daniel Elazar, and so good. So Bob says orderly and fair are not the same, right? But I think you need both, right? You can't have fairness unless it's orderly, and you can't. And if it's only orderly, then it's not justice, right? There's another place. Bob says there's another place. Do not favor the rich, right? That's later. The Deuteronomy is filled with more of details about court procedure and things like that, which we're not going to get into today. Okay, so I'm going to. I'll get this one. Lauren Davis says, so you are interpreting this as a democratic selection through representatives of the people? Maybe. We don't know how they did this election. It could have been the richest person that got chosen to be the judge. It could have been the person with the most yichis, like the best family line. I don't know, but it's still about the people are choosing and accepting the leadership, right? Good. All right. Now, next branch. If, and this is a translation question, maybe we'll get to. If after you have entered the land that Adonai your God has assigned to you and taken possession of it and settled in it, you decide, I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me. You shall be free to set a king over yourself, one chosen by Adonai, by God. Be sure to set a king over yourself, one of your own people. You must not set a foreigner over you, one who is not your kin. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses. Or I'll stop there for a second. Okay? And I say this is a translation issue because you can read it as if, but you could also read it as when. This word ki right here in Hebrew could be if, could be when. But I think if you read this and read the book of Samuel together, it probably means if. If after you enter the land, you decide that you need a king. Why might you need a king? I think security, I think unity, I think even efficiency to create a bureaucracy. Those are things that the king might bring. But what's the critique of that? I will set a king over me, as do all the nations about me, right? Meaning, I read this as this is having a king is kind of second best. It means that you're not living up to what Israelite culture is supposed to be, right? That's kind of how I'm reading it. Now, there are limits on the king. One, he has to be an Israelite. Two, or then continue. Moreover, he shall not keep many horses or send people back to Egypt to add to his horses. Since Adonai has warned you, you must not go back that way again. What does horses mean? Someone give me in the chat what a good analogy to a horse today. Wealth, maybe, but I think it's more specific than that. I would say a good analogy today are tanks and airplanes, tanks and fighter jets. Right? I think that's what it's talking about. And he shall not have many wives, lest his heart go astray. What might that be about? I think it's one about, maybe it's misogynistic, but it's also about foreign entanglements. And heart going astray means towards idolatry. When the king marries the daughter of the Egyptian, Pharaoh, the daughter of the Moabite king, right? It's about idolatry. And you see that also in the story of Solomon in the book of Kings. Nor shall he amass silver and gold to excess. Wealth. Where does the wealth come from? The people. When he is seated on his royal throne, he shall have a copy of this teaching, which in Hebrew is Mishneh Torah. Is this teaching just the book of Deuteronomy? A historian might say yes. Jewish tradition says he needs to write his own Torah and have it with him, scribe his own Torah. Shall have a copy of this teaching written for him on a scroll by the Levitical priests, lest it remain with him. Let it remain with him and let him read it all of his life, so that he may learn to revere God, Adonai, to observe faithfully every word of the teaching as well as these laws. Thus, he will not act haughtily towards his fellows or deviate from the instruction to the right or the left, to the end that he and his descendants may reign long in the midst of Israel. So it's not, I don't read this just as the king being wise and knowing the laws. What is it? It's also saying the king is also a citizen who is under the law, right? The king is, the king is not the embodiment of the law, as some, monarchies see themselves. Definitely at that time, the king is just a citizen who has the job of king to enforce the law, right?
Yeah, can I jump in there with a thought that makes me think about?
Please.
First, you asked before, what's the criticism, the critique of monarchy here? One of the critiques in terms of where monarchy comes from is that it comes from fear. The people want a king because first of all, they want to be more like all the other nations. And also, I think they're afraid for their security, right? So there's some kind of a sense here that we need a king because we're afraid that if we're not stronger, centrally stronger, we're going to be endangered by other people. It's very inward looking, very isolationist.
Hmm.
versus seeing the state as needing to be in relationship with others. The
Yep.
other thought I had was I think the second thing you said about the king being subject to the law, it's worth comparing with other ancient kingdoms. You and I
Good.
talked about this in our preparations, right? Like
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.
the
Yeah.
Pharaoh is a god. The
Yeah.
Babylonian emperor is a god. The Roman emperor is a god.
Yeah.
Our king, the Jewish king, is below God, is subject to the law because God is the embodiment of the law rather than the
Exactly.
king.
Exactly. And that goes back to Genesis 1, where God creates the human in God's image. That is a critique of, biblical scholars will say kingly theology of the time, because the Babylonian king was the image of the gods, right? The Egyptian king was the incarnation of a god, while in Genesis chapter 1, right at the beginning of the Torah, it is saying, what is it saying? If we're all created in the image of God, we are all kings and queens, right? And I,
Which actually relates to the talit also. The reason that we all have a little thread of blue on our talit traditionally according to the Torah. I mean, the
yeah,
Torah doesn't say this, but the commentators say, because that bluish purplish color was the color of royalty. So
yeah.
every member of the community gets
Mhm.
a thread of that because we're all supposed to be royalty in some way.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And so, later in the Bible, the book of Judges, the book of Samuel, it's an argument about, do we need a king? Do we not need a king? Are we all, is the tribal system with different leaders and then every once in a while, one leader unifying everybody, is that what we're actually called for? I would say the king here becomes kind of a concession for practical reasons. But in our theology is we are all the actual king's representative on earth, right? And the actual king, the true sovereign, is God, right? Good.
We
Um,
we have a hand up from Daniel,
please.
Rabbi Satz, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Daniel, please.
Yes, yes, thank you. I was already asking the question in the chat. I want to still put it on because it perfectly fits with the point that Rabbi Micah put with that like dictatorships put themselves as God, like as their incarnation of God. So if we could compare even like nowadays democracy where even like the chancellors or the prime ministers feel themselves like entitled or like untouchable like God, if
Yeah,
they could end up be like worse in the manner of the values that we now read compared to a like Jewish like just or like moderate dictatorship who still puts himself under the law is
yeah.
how would you see it?
Thank you for the question, and tell me if I'm, approaching the way you're thinking. Like, um, yes. And first, I'll say, if you read, here's everybody's homework: read the book of Samuel, read the book, and read the book of Judges, read the book of Samuel, and then read the beginning of the King, and most of the book of Kings, or all the book of Kings. It's arguing this point, and especially in the book of Kings, the kings in it, never, only a few of them live up to this, right? Like the Jewish national literature hates, I'll be hyperbolic, hates the Jews, meaning we never live up. It is not a glorious past that we think about, right? And even David, the great king, is very flawed, right? And Solomon, also the one we think is great, if you did all of these things that Deuteronomy says he can't do, right? And then the worst sin that the kings do is idolatry, because idolatry is saying, if they're not saying I am a god, they're saying I can control the gods, right? The gods, right? And so when we think about dictators today, Daniel says it's about embodying the state, right? The state, like King Louis XIV, the state is me, right? And it's about that my will is law, right? and even enlightened dictators, quote, enlightened dictators, right? So it's an interesting point here. It does not say the king makes the law. Who makes the law? And there's no legislature either, right? Who makes the law? We have the law already. God is the one who makes the law. We interpret it for our life, and therefore we are God's embodiment on earth in different ways. The king has one job, the judges have other jobs. We'll see the priests in a second. We'll see a prophet soon. And then maybe I'll talk about the people if we get to it at the end, right?
And what you're saying, sorry if I can jump in one more time, I think relates to what Alfred put in the chat also, which is he said when Deuteronomy was written, there had been kings for 400 years. So,
Hmm.
right, this text, it sort of purports to be said by Moses in the desert as if
Good.
Moses, is talking about what might happen in the future. But Deuteronomy is actually written probably by priests. I mean,
Yeah,
some
yeah,
people think that Josiah and his people wrote it. I just
yeah.
finished reading or rereading this book by Michael Satz, How the Bible Became Holy. He
Hmm.
suggests that Deuteronomy is written by priests who are looking to limit the power of the king. They lived
Yeah.
in a monarchy. They knew what kings could do. So they wrote a sort of an idealized version of a state that
Hmm.
put the king underneath the law versus having the king be above the law. I don't know that we
Good.
can say that that reflects actual reality in ancient Israel as much as it reflects somebody's view of what a king or what a sovereign ought to be.
Right, exactly. And who knows? Like we don't know if the king had a copy of this at his throne, right? We don't know. This
Seems
is I
highly unlikely.
but what is the story we as a people have told ourselves? Even I'll say even it was written at some point during the Judahite monarchy, right? Probably at the time of Josiah. But what is the story we're telling ourselves? The story we're telling ourselves is that God is interested in the people creating I'll use a government that enacts justice, right? That that separates powers, that does not have a king that is a god, right? And in the book of Deuteronomy, there are constitutional acceptance ceremonies, right? Or we would say in religious language, Brit, a covenant, right? But the people are accepting this on them. So it's not the leader. Well, if God as the leader, but it's the people accepting it is acceptance of the governed to be like Hobbesian about it, right? Um, and and so that's the story we tell ourselves. Uh, like every constitution has a story too, right? The American Constitution, that we could ask a historian what actually happened in Philadelphia that day, but our grand myth of it is that we are the people. We are the people, right? We the people. It starts with the preamble is a story, right? And so, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought, but I think like the historical question of when this came about is important, but it's also uh, but also the bigger picture is this is how our people have seen our Constitution, if you will, to use political terms, right?
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Yeah,
Um, what you're showing us is really interesting. Deuteronomy has a sort of a version of separation of powers. Why do you think, what is the Torah so afraid of? Why is the Torah so negative about concentrating powers in the hands of a single sovereign?
because as it said when we were talking about the king, you're not to go back to Egypt. To sum it up succinctly, how they do things in Egypt is not how we do things here. We enact God's will through it, or I'll say back to being created in the image of God. Every citizen, to use modern political terms, every citizen is the embodiment of God's will, or tries to live up to be the embodiment of God's will. And so, is that a government for the people by the people? It's not quite the same thing as American democracy, but it is like an influence on that, right? And
Yeah,
so, in,
I'm thinking about Egypt. Egypt here represents I mean,
Yeah.
Egypt represents the god, the sovereign who is a god, but
The
Egypt also
sovereign.
represents enslavement, right? You are enslaved to this king.
Exactly. And Egypt, and right, and Egypt, and even like to think about, this talk about in some of the prophets, the geography of Egypt is the Nile that uh, gives sustenance to the people, and the Pharaoh is in charge of the Nile, right? While the Israelites live by faith with God will bring the rain based on our behavior, right? And so it's a covenantal relationship rather than a master-slave relationship,
Well,
right?
and that also then introduces the element of ethics into it, right? Because if you read, what is expected of Israel that will bring the rain, part of it's
Yeah,
about fidelity to God. If you worship idols, I might not send the rain. But part of it is about taking care of the widow and the orphan and the stranger, right?
right.
So there's a certain type of society we're supposed to have.
Which you need impartial courts to do, which you need a king who's not above the law to do, maybe, which you need the orderly system of worship in the temple, which we'll see, right? And so like all of these things go into, and every Israelite citizen also wears the seat. Back to your analogy, Micah, every Israelite citizen has the same mitzvot as the king, right? They just have different jobs, if you will, right? Good. So, do you mind? We'll move now to the priests, right? There is no separation of church and state, but there is a separation of who runs the church, if you will, right? The Levitical priests, the whole tribe of Levi, shall have no territorial portion with Israel, meaning they don't own land. They shall live only off Adonai's offerings by fire as their portion, meaning they eat by the sacrifices that people bring to the temple, right? And shall have no portion among their brother tribes, Adonai their portion as promised. This then shall be the priest's due from the people. Everyone who offers a sacrifice, whether an ox or a sheep, must give the shoulder, the cheeks, or the stomach to the priest. You shall also give him the first fruits of your new grain and wine and oil, and the first shearing of your sheep. For Adonai God has chosen him and his descendants out of all your tribes to be in attendance for service in the name of Adonai for all time. Good. So, sorry, maybe I'll keep it up if we refer to it. The priests, the historical argument is, were all the Levite priests at this time? Was there a difference between priests and Levites? We don't need to argue that right now because it's read differently in the book of Leviticus, right? But here we see checks and balances. The priests not owning land, their livelihood is the people, right? And therefore they are there to serve, right? But also in the portion about the king, it's also the priest's job that they write the Torah with the God, or with the king. So it seems like there are also teachers, right? Comments, questions?
Yeah, I'm always struck by that idea that the priests are supposed to read to the king
Yeah,
from the scroll, which first of all tells us the king might not have been able to read because
perhaps,
in
perhaps.
ancient times, not everybody could read.
Perhaps, but historically, like the Book of Kings is very focused on saying all the names of the king's scribes and things like that. So, at least in the higher echelons, it was a literate society, right? The king read, I don't know, but people were reading to him. And today a lot of people read by audiobooks. So I would say we could still be literate even if you don't read, right?
For sure. But
Yeah,
even in a world where the king can read,
yeah,
I think some of the point there is, I mean, the person reading, in this moment, it's a priest. Later on, it might have been an interpreter or a rabbi or
mhm,
something like
mhm,
that. That person then represents a certain wisdom tradition, right? So I wonder if part of what we're seeing here is that the king is supposed to have advisors who, by the
mhm,
way, he's not appointing these priests, right? It makes me think about Abraham Lincoln, who brought together this group of advisors that didn't all agree with him, that, they were giving him different points of view that were not always his own, and
right.
that the king now should be read to and interpreted to and taught by someone that he doesn't get, that's not a yes man to him.
Good. Yeah, exactly. So you read the Book of Kings, they did have advisors that they appoint and came from their family or whatever. but right, the priesthood it's through lineage, right? And so they're separate from the king, right? Now, the king is a monarchy, and it goes from father to son, and there's bloody battles to choose the next king. But back to so we do have inherited titles, but back to the judges, it seems like those are chosen by the tribes, right? The shoftim and the shotrim, the judges and the local administrators, are chosen by the people of the tribe. So we have a balance of power and a kind of federalism there by different ways of choosing leaders, right?
Yes, you have a few different ways, right? A few different ways of having leaders be appointed, which, truly in the American and Canadian systems as well. Some leaders are appointed, some leaders are elected. I know in Canadian democracy, our lower house, the House of Commons or the Parliament, is elected, but then there's an upper house which is called the Senate. For those who are not Canadians here, which is appointed, which is supposed to provide sober second thought to be able to sort of balance out the partisan politics that go on in the other house.
Right. And so you can see in the priesthood here lives in all the territories. They didn't only live in Jerusalem. They lived in all the territories, but they didn't own their own land, right? So they are local, but also not local, right? So that kind of gives a check too. And they had specific functions, right? So they did not become the king or did not become the shotrim or what, a shoter or something like that, right? Yeah. And Ira has his hand raised.
Oh, this is probably just maybe a little overlap, but it seems to me in these earliest governments, instead of institutions like Congress and the judiciary, the earliest kings seem to be accountable to the priests, like you guys were saying, the priests and the tribal leaders and the judges and the prophets. And there were checks and balances, whereas like an authoritarian leader says, I alone am in charge of every.
Exactly. And so I think, like, again, I'm not claiming there's a democracy, but it's giving us democratic values, right? There are small d democratic values here, in that no one person is the state. Even so much that the state is God, like God's the sovereign, and we enact God's sovereignty. When we all have different people have different roles, and they check each other in different ways, right? Yeah.
Right. So much so that, for example, someone like Spinoza, who's writing in the 16th century, who's really advocating for democracy, he calls on the example of the ancient Hebrew state as he calls it a theocracy, which it is, but he points out the difference between what's sort of a pure theocracy, which is that God is the sovereign, and what we might think of as a theocracy, which is like Iran, where the sovereign is a religious leader, right? A priest. Right. The priest is the sovereign. And Spinoza suggests that the kind of separation of powers that's going on in the Hebrew Bible can be a model for us in building a new form of government. But for his God, the God that's in charge, is really a God that is sort of like the sovereign right of all people, right? Spinoza is again, small d Democrat, right? Someone who believes that all people have the right to sovereignty. And he illustrates that by showing that in this system, no one person gets to be in charge because God is in charge, and God represents the sovereignty in a way of all people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And I'll bring up Martin Buber too, who was writing in the in the early 20th century, or the first part of the 20th century, and he also calls the biblical political system as a theocracy, as a positive thing. He saw the king as a concession that God allows, and the real theocracy is kind of an anarchy, meaning not chaos, but meaning that like there's different models of leadership that come up when needed, as long as people recognizing that no one person is the actual is actually totally in charge, right? Mm-hmm. He calls it the kingdom of God, right?
Which I think relates to what Bruno put in the chat. What about the modern concept that a constitutional monarch shields democracy by not letting the head of government become all powerful or dictator.
Right. So you would hope that, yeah. So like, it's funny, like growing up in America, I was always anti-democracy, but then living in Canada for 5 years.
Anti-monarchy is what you meant there, right?
I'm sorry, anti-monarchy. Yes, yes. I was always anti-monarchy, but then living in Canada for only 5 years, but married to a Canadian. So I've been connected to Canada for, 20 years, recognizing, even though most Canadians don't think about their constitutional monarch that much, but when they do, you see it as a decent system that the constitutional monarch is the symbol of something greater than just power, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will tell you, I am an American who became a Canadian, and I raised my right hand and I swore allegiance to Queen Elizabeth II at the time. And it was as a strange thing to think about having a sovereign, but as the sovereign in this system represents something kind of like what I think God represents for Spinoza, which is the sovereignty of the people. There's not really any one person in charge, but the sovereign person represents the fact that power rests in the hands of the nation.
Right. And as an American, I would say the problem with that is there is an actual king who has actual life who can do bad things, right? But it's also there was an interesting article I once read, I think it was written in the 90s by Michael Wishograd, who was a modern Orthodox thinker. And he wrote that the Israeli government should be a monarchy, not meaning that there's an actual king, but that they should have if I remember, that they should have a throne and call it the House of David. And then it's the symbol of something greater than just the politics of the Knesset, right? Now, there is a president in Israel who serves more like, the German president kind of, right? Or like, other countries have more of a figurehead president, but it's not representing, something even greater. Now, I don't think his idea was a great idea, but like you see where he's coming from, right?
Well, and you could see, all right, you're as an American critiquing the Canadian system. I think then the critique of the American system could be that there is no actual symbol
for sure,
that
for sure.
represents the sovereignty of the people.
Right. And something that we were talking about a lot in America, underneath what we're talking about in America is like the president becomes the politician who does things, but also the president is a symbol of something, right? So like, Canadians, people in the UK, they do not see, for the most part, their prime minister as a symbol of something. They're just the person who runs the government. And the king becomes the symbol of something, right? But in America, it's both. The president, even though we elect them, becomes a symbol of the country in some way, right? So
Mary points out in the chat that the Constitution is the symbol, I think, which I think is correct.
Right. Yeah, I think the Constitution is more like the constitutional monarch, right? Even though the people are sovereign in an American democracy. Yeah, good. So that does President Herzog represent something? Mary asked. So President, Yitzhak Herzog is the president of Israel. What does he represent? And I think it's the Israeli president is supposed to represent a consensus, kind of like a consensus, honored post for a consensus person who could bring the country together in a symbolic way. I think that's what it's kind of supposed to be. They're also the person like the British monarch who accepts the government after the election, right? Chooses the government after the election, right? Good. Yeah, and so Deborah's talking about that difference between the head of government and the head of state, right? Good. Let's keep going with this constitutional system. From among your own people, Adonai your God will raise up for you a prophet like myself. Now, this is Moses talking. That is whom you shall heed. This is just what you asked for, God, at Horeb, that's Deuteronomy's name for Sinai, on the day of the assembly, saying, let us not hear the voice of my God, Adonai, any longer to see this wondrous fire any more, lest I die. Right? The people were scared. They only wanted to hear from Moses, not God's actual voice. Whereupon Adonai said to me, They have done well in speaking thus. I will raise up for them among their own people a prophet like yourself, in whose mouth I will put my words, and who will I speak to them all that I command. And nobody who fails to heed the words of the prophet speaks in my name. I myself will call to account. But any prophet who presumes to speak in my name an oracle that I did not command to be uttered, or who speaks in the name of other gods, that prophet shall die. You and should you ask yourselves, how can we know that the oracle was not spoken by Adonai? If the prophet speaks in the name of Adonai and the oracle does not come true, that oracle was not spoken by Adonai. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in dread of that person. Okay, so what is this other branch of government? A prophet, right? Now, notice how I said there was no legislative branch because we have the Torah. God's the legislator, but sometimes we need someone to tell us about the Torah, right? And I think that's the prophet. I think that's what it's getting at, to put us back on track of the Torah, of living through Torah, right? So they become only in certain circumstances, it's saying God's representative on earth saying we're doing it wrong, right?
And maybe then most of all, right, saying that we're doing it wrong, because the prophet is also the social critic
Yeah,
who
right.
yells at you for not taking good enough care of the widow, the poor, the orphan, and the poor.
Exactly. Exactly. When the other branches of the government fail, the prophet is there to get them back on track. I'll say it this way, God has to enter the scene in some way. The other branches of government takes what God gives us and enacts them. And sometimes God has to enter into the picture to say we're doing it wrong. I think that's what the prophet is.
Well, and the later rabbis understand themselves as kind of playing this role of interpreting Torah, teaching people what it's supposed to be saying. And Robert put in the chat, Nathan the prophet checking David. I think it's extraordinary that the Torah enshrines the prophet as a form of government, essentially, because nobody likes these people, right? Kings don't like prophets. Nobody wants to hear everything they're doing wrong. Some politicians who will remain nameless have shut those people out of the press room, for example, right? In some way, this is like the press that criticizes the government and reminds people that there is a higher authority to which they are responsible. Call it God, call it the Constitution, call it life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Torah and the book of Samuel in the form of Nathan and David says not only do we want to hear from this person, but sometimes we'll even put them in the court. Sometimes we even put this person right beside the king so that the king can hear from them regularly.
So, and one of the problems of Kings in the book of Kings, especially, is that the court prophet, the prophet that's inside the palace, becomes a yes man. And they're and then there are obviously false prophets that you see. And the outside prophet, like Elijah, becomes hunted by the king, right? And so but in the ideal system of Deuteronomy, right, the prophet is an essential part to get the whole system back on track.
So it shouldn't just be Breitbart in the press room, in other words.
Correct. It's not it's different than the press room, right? And in the biblical system, the prophet is literally speaking God's words. It's God entering into the picture every once in a while, right? It's not, we could say, the press is like our prophets today, but it's more than that, right, in the Bible, right? And it's because we all have the job of enacting the sovereignty on earth. We could fall down on the job and God has to pick us back up.
Yeah, I wonder if the existence of the prophet is a kind of a recognition of the frailty of human beings, the desire for power, the way that people in power tend to want to surround themselves with people that agree with them, and the way that people in society tend to want to just focus on being comfortable. As long as I'm comfortable, then do I need to worry about those who are vulnerable? And the prophet constantly is reminding us that, yes, a society that is doing what's required is not only one that makes sure that, that you're comfortable, but actually makes sure that everybody is taken care of.
Right. And if you read the books of the prophets, what do they complain about when it comes to leadership? That the judges are not judging fairly, that the priests are taking bribes, and that the king is idolatrous, right? and that all trickles down to the people, right?
Mhm.
And
This,
so it right, and so it's another check that nobody listened to, but they were the least successful leaders in the history of the Jewish people, but it's an extreme check that needs to come in sometimes, right?
yeah,
And
this feels like a good opportunity for me to plug a class that's happening next Monday. We still have a few minutes left, but next Monday, we didn't do this on purpose, but I'm going to be leading a class as part of our social justice and our text series that is about Abraham Joshua Heschel's view of prophecy and social justice. I'm just dropping it in the chat there. Heschel really believes that the prophet is the voice of social justice in society, and he has a very moving and very important sort of explication of what is the role of the prophet and how are all of us in some way called to be prophets. Which I think also speaks to what Alfred just dropped in the chat, which is from the Talmud, where it says that since the day the temple was destroyed, prophecy was given. Oh, it's actually slightly different than what Alfred put in the chat. Prophecy was given to children and fools. In other words, there are no more prophets. The rabbis are very afraid of prophecy because they're afraid.
because
Oh, go ahead.
each branch of this government it's dangerous too, right? And being a prophet could also saying you're a prophet could also be dangerous, right?
Right, because they're afraid of anybody who claims to speak for God. So that's
Yeah.
why the rabbis reject people who claim to speak for God. And they suggest that God speaks through text instead. Of course, what does that do? It makes them the interpreters. So it's also the rabbis grabbing authority for themselves. But I think it's also a sort of an expression of them being very wary of anybody who would claim that they know what God wants and they're going to enact it on behalf of society.
And um, I want to kind of sum up or add one more point to this constitutional system, because if you think about in the Torah, before they enter the land, think about Moses. He does all of these things, right? But throughout the Torah, he then passes on the authority for those things for other people. And it says in Deuteronomy, there will be no prophet like Moses, or there is no prophet like Moses, who was the humble. He's the only person who could have done all these things because he was the most humble person, right? And so he passes on the priesthood to his brother. He passes on the civil authority to Joshua. He passes on or God will pass on the prophetic authority to other people, right? And then the judge, there's the story of Moses' father-in-law telling him you need to set up a court system. You can't do this all, right? So he passes those on to what are called the elders, right? The heads of the different tribes, right?
Yeah,
And so,
and then what does the Torah do? It kills him off, right?
and
So
then he died.
there's no
Yeah.
more Moses. There will never, ever, ever be anyone like Moses. So if you think that your sovereign is supposed to embody all these branches of government, think again, because it should never happen again, as far as the Torah is concerned.
Right. And not only does Moses die, but we don't know where he's buried, right? So he doesn't become an idol too, right? I want to end one more text, very short, that I just read about yesterday from that I thought about it differently yesterday. That I mentioned the political science Daniel Elazar. This text from a vote from the Mishnah. Rabbi Shimon said, "Shlosha ketarim hem." There are three crowns, right? The crown of Torah, the crown of priesthood, and the crown of royalty. Now, Elazar translates it not as royalty, of civic leadership, right? Malchut doesn't just mean royalty, it means the government, right? And so he's saying this is the word the rabbis here are using, the keter, which means crown, means branches. You could read this politically. There's the branch of Torah. Who's that? The priests, or sorry, the prophet, maybe the rabbis as teachers and explicators, right? There's the branch of the kehuna, the priesthood, right? The ongoing worship in the temple, how God talks to us through Torah, we talk to God through the temple, through our sacrifices. And then the crown of the civic authority, right? It could be the judges, it could be the king. It's unclear in the Bible, sometimes they overlap. But the crown of a good name supersedes them all. And I want to read this as the crown of a good name is you need to have a virtuous individuals in the polity, virtuous citizens living in the society. And so we are also a check on the of the government. Is this democratic? Maybe, but it's the democratic value here is that we are all part of this project, right?
Yeah, maybe you could read the Shem Tov, the crown of the good name there, as the informed and engaged citizenry who
Yeah.
are who really sit, above the entire system.
Yeah, right. And the rabbi's project is that we all live lives of holiness, not just like the priest. We all live lives of God's image, not just like the king, right? And we can all live lives of Torah, not just the prophet, right? We are all of these things. Yeah.
Well, I want to thank my friend and colleague, Rabbi Michael Satz, for leading us through this first of 2 sessions. This was really, really interesting, and I appreciate everybody's engagement in this. Next week, we're back here again. We're going to do the same thing, same bat time, same bat channel, as we say, but we're going to look instead at some of the institutions around how do decisions get made in society. The rabbis have a lot. We'll move to rabbinic literature, and the rabbis have quite a lot to say about agreeing and disagreeing, minorities and majorities, and what it means to vote, what it means for something to be true for a society. So we will continue this discussion next Thursday, again at noon Eastern, 9 a.m. Pacific, same Zoom link. And once again, thanks to everybody for being here. And thank you to Rabbi Michael Satz.
Yeah, thank you for learning with me, friends. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week, or tell your friends too to come.
All right. Take care, everyone.